Welcome to Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Hard to believe, but it's been 10 years since Inside the New York Times Book Review first hit the podcast airwaves. Are there even airwaves for podcasts? In any case, last week I sat down with three of my favorite people in the literary world to talk about the history of the show. Dwight Garner, former senior editor of the Book Review and current book critic at the Times, came up with the idea to do the podcast back in 2006. Sam Tanenhaus, former editor of the Book Review, was its host from launch to 2013, and Gary Shteyngart, novelist, memoirist, and generally very funny person, was our very first podcast guest. So podcasts are now the super hip and cool thing, but you guys started it when they were not so hip or cool. Dwight, it was your idea. How did you come up with this?
Well, flashing back to 2006, we didn't have the iPhone yet. We had the iPod, and I think 2006 was just about the year when it sunk in that print might actually really die. We sort of knew before, but that was about the time when I think it started to sink in and thinking we have to sort of think about some other ideas. And podcasts were just getting popular about that. I remember liking one by Ricky Gervais at the time, and I also think I wanted to impress my boss, Sam Tanenhaus. So I said, Sam, let's try one of these things. And you were pretty...
I had no idea what he was talking about.
So did you know what it was going to be? You also started our blog, the Paper Cuts, the former blog, so you were sort of coming from the internet and starting up all of these things. Did you have an idea of what a book review podcast should be?
I had no idea. And I think that Sam actually found the tone because he's sort of a natural. I'm the kind of person who, when I went in to do my part of the podcast, I'd have every bit written out. Like, I'd write Sam's line, Sam, ask Dwight X, and I would read from my answers. And Sam just has this Charlie Rose ability to leap in and just take it. So I think that was the initial dynamic, unless I'm mistaken.
I think he just said that I interrupted everybody all the time, because that's what Charlie Rose did. He doesn't do it as much as he used to. Actually, I remember the first idea Dwight had for it, which was that it would be much longer than it is, and it would include a reading, like a 20-minute reading by an author, because that was still the idea we had.
I was pretentious.
Well, no, there's sort of, because that's what you, it was kind of an amalgam of what you might hear in NPR, plus if you went to an author reading at a bookstore, and I think that was the idea Dwight had. And he wanted to find remember you wanted to find like an NPR person to be the host? As if we could have afforded it, first of all. But
you
wanted
remember
to get
this really quite well.
Yeah, you wanted a professional interviewer, because I remember there are innumerable ways in which I'm utterly obnoxious, but one way in which I'm not, I don't think, is that I wouldn't inject myself in something unless I thought, it might make sense. And I remember thinking over the weekend, well, why don't I do it? Why don't I be the host? First of all, it doesn't cost us anything. Second, if you're trying to get this thing started and they were new at the paper, if you had the editor of the section doing it, it might give it a little more authority or something.
I think I might have thought you might not have wanted to do it, possibly.
Yeah, well, the best thing, though, was when Dwight sent a note to Gary and said, would you like to come in and do a podcast? And I'll never forget the response, which was, yes, or at least find out what one is.
It's really true. I said this to my publicist. I said, what's a podcast? And she couldn't explain it either. And actually, 10 years later, I still have no idea what a podcast is. I assume we're on the radio, right, of some kind. In fact, and you sent me a link to the podcast that we did, so I kind of went down memory lane and revisited that 10 years ago.
What was it like listening to that very first podcast?
I was such an earnest guy. I was like, oh my God, I'm at the New York Times.
You were funny, though. You were really funny.
Thank you. And I was so scared, I remember taking like 10 Xanaxes just to get started. And I brought some with me just for old times.
Well, we learned a lot of basic things starting out. We did not have as good recording equipment and such. We had the amazing Jocelyn, who records it now, who really is a professional producer. We would just pass a microphone around, and it was mainly staff. So it might be a copy editor at the book review, and you'd say, well, what's this new novel about? And the editor would say, well, according to our reviewer, this kind of thing. Then we realized we could get authors to come in, brilliant and renowned author here, and then we'd do a critic, and then it kind of evolved. But Dwight had all the basic ideas. Dwight wanted to do the best sellers, which he did, and Dwight also invented the bestseller list in the book review. All of you now probably know, most aware of Dwight as an exceptional book critic, one of the best ever, not just one of the best now. But he was at least as brilliant an editor at the book review. A great signer. Some of the best reviews we ever did were Dwight's idea. If anybody remembers Garrison Keillor's review of Bernard-Henri Lévy's tour of America.
That was fun.
Bernard-Henri Lévy remembers that.
Yes, that was Dwight's idea.
He was hoping to do a road
all
show
of that
with
stuff.
Garrison Keillor.
And so he had the ideas for all these things, and then the rest of us would just sort of.
You also picked out the music.
What was the music in the first episode? Do you
Was that
remember?
rock and roll?
We had
read
that
it in the
rock
New York
thing,
Times book review.
That was this little punk song about the Times Book Review by a band called J Church.
All right, let's listen to a little bit from that very first episode, because Sam, you asked Gary if he would start blogging, and Gary talked a little bit about his feelings about the internet.
You won't be giving up fiction for a blog anytime soon?
I don't know how to operate my iPod, so the blog is sorely out of the question. There will be no blog. I'm not against other forms of literary endeavors, if you will. I can't out of hand dismiss them, because the novel was dismissed at one point. Everything is new things. I am open to new forms. But I do think that the novel has not outlived its usefulness yet by any stretch of the imagination. Despite the falling attention spans and despite the prevalence of other media. And I've myself, look, I'll admit it, I've been terribly derailed by the internet. I spend much valuable time that should be spent reading real works of literature. I spend much of it on fluff, which I shouldn't do, but it's addictive. It sucks you in. So I am turning off the Wi-Fi in my apartment, and I'm going to get a landline, which makes it very hard to run around with this thing. And I'm going to suffer, but I'm going to do it for a good cause.
All right, I saw Gary at a party on Tuesday, a dinner for poetry, a fine art form, and one of the first things that Gary did was show me something from his Instagram feed. So clearly...
I lost big time. That experiment about turning off the Wi-Fi and getting a wire to my computer lasted all of 10 minutes. Yeah. And I was like, the hell with this, and went back to Wi-Fi. No, it's over. Zadie Smith does a good thing. She has that program Freedom. It's
Right.
not just a Franzen novel, it's an actual program that allows you, that actually shuts you off from the internet, and you have to do all this other stuff to get back on it. I'm not ready to try it, but I guess I should.
But you're thinking about maybe getting ready to
Maybe
try it at
perhaps
some point.
sort of one day.
Sam, how did you get ready to host the podcast? Did you have a model?
No, but what I remember is one of your predecessors, Julie Just, predecessor because she became children's book editor and also had been a deputy, she brought in someone who had been a producer for the old Dick Cavett show. Anybody remember that? It was actually a pretty great talk show. That's where Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer would come to blows. I remember he had Cheever and Updike on together. He had Bellow on for 3 sessions, all this. And so the producer came in and said, one thing that impressed him about Cavett was he would seem completely spaced out and clueless and enervated until the moment the camera turned on, and then he would spring into action. So I thought, well, I'll just imitate that. I'll pretend to act as if I'm distracted and uninterested, and then become animated when the microphone comes on. So it began with that pretentiousness. The other thing was, initially, I actually wrote scripts, which no one will remember. We had this idea, we had no notion of what the content for the podcast should be. And so Rachel Donadio was our reporter then. I think the only full-time reporter the book review ever had. She would write essays for us. Some of them were quite wonderful and important essays. And so we thought, well, we'd do this girl-guy thing. We would be this team. So I actually wrote a script for us that thought we would present with funny chatter going back and forth, and somebody who at WQXR, because they were sort of overseeing at the old radio station, said, no, you can't do that. Said, nice try, kind of thing. So instead, I would write out a little introduction for myself, and there were really corny, stupid jokes that I began with, and then they got so embarrassing, I stopped doing them. But at one point early on, I don't know if Mick Sussman is here. He was our first producer. And Mick was really the co-creator of it with Dwight. Mick came up with a lot of the formats and all the rest, and he was the one who discovered we could bring authors in. So at one point, Mick was sitting in front of his computer listening to the podcast, and what I heard was that If I read off a script, my voice got very flat and monotonous. Only really good professionals can do that. A normal person, an amateur, can't read off a script a lot without it sounding flat. So that's why I stopped doing that. So that was the only other change I made. And the other was not to over-prepare, which meant not to prepare at all, which one had always ridiculed like television interviewers for. They'd never read the book and all that. So there's actually a reason. There's a good excuse for not reading the book, which is that if you haven't read it, you'll ask the very simple, basic questions that listeners who don't know the book and don't know the review are more likely to want to hear. So it made it sort of easier for me. And that was it. Thereafter, it was just the easiest thing to do is to ask the questions.
That was Sam's main advice to me when I started the podcast. I think I was sort of furiously taking notes on the book review and looking through a book, frantically before going on. And he was like, "What the hell are you doing? Put that down. Don't prepare."
Yeah, it's you want it to be spontaneous. Also, you can't be afraid to sound stupid, because if it gets a good answer from somebody, that's okay. So Mr. Amos, so this seems to be what's going on in the new novel. And he says, "No, it's not." Well, that's good. That's good radio. So if you're not afraid to make a fool of yourself, or in my case, you don't have any option, you're always going to make a fool of yourself, it can make pretty good radio.
Well, you said, that makes good radio. Is there a difference, do you think, Dwight, between podcasting and radio?
I don't know. I was going to say, I remember once I was filling in for Sam, and it was a famous British novelist coming in. I won't name her, female novelist. And she came in about an hour and a half early. I hadn't prepared. I had not read her novel. I was in the middle of something else, and there she was. And I thought to myself, what would Sam do? And so we went back into the room and taped, and I just said something like, "Your book, why now?" And just, it worked out great. So when in doubt, what would Sam do?
Now we're all going to have to go back through the online archives and figure out what was that book, who was that novelist. This is not our first live podcast. You guys did a few of them, right? At Housing Works, at Barnes & Noble. I want to just play a clip of Dwight live at Housing Works in 2011.
Well, you're conscious of the audience to the extent that it's hard to review a book of poetry. It's not hard. No one would prevent me, and I shouldn't prevent myself, but it's hard to find a book of poetry to review negatively in the New York Times. And by that, negative poetry reviews famously are quite rare, because so few people read poetry. You're in the position of saying, that thing you never heard of? Well, it's terrible. So this is this awkward...
People write about my books that way.
You go through the books and try to find unknown poets to champion. But it's hard to find mid-range poets that they want the attention, but you don't want to take up the space to say, this is not worth reading. Poetry suffers a bit from too much championing, I think. And reviewers respond to negative reviews of poetry because they feel like someone is attending to actuality. They're telling the truth, because all readers don't like all poetry, and yet everything they hear about poetry is so positive.
Dwight, what about this question of narrative? Do you actually structure a review differently when you're writing about it?
You take notes and you think about what this poet is trying to say. You take note of the language. One of the great things about reading good poems, and it's actually very easy, there's a deep secret that it's easy to review poems because you quote the poem, and it takes up half the damn space. Because if you quote a few times, really you only have to write about 300 words in an 800-word review, because that little quote eats up the space that would normally require 400 words. But quoting well is very important, I think, in terms of getting readers to care about poetry, because the stuff is there, readers just don't know where to find it. And the way to convince them to read poetry is not often you screaming and letting your hair on fire, or what was used to be your hair on fire. It's quoting extremely well.
What's it like listening to yourself on the podcast?
I loathe hearing myself on any kind of recording, even the answering machine. So thank you for that, Pam.
Just to torment you.
But can I add something about Dwight? Dwight is the greatest reviewer of poetry who's ever written for a newspaper in the English language. And part of it is Dwight knows how to quote.
Do you feel quoted well in your reviews? Do you feel like they picked the smart?
No.
They change the subject. Thank you, sir.
No. People always, I have lines that I've labored over and have made the most beautiful lines in the history of the English language. Really. Yeah, no. But they always pick the crap right around there. The lead up to that brilliant line. Yeah, no, I could use better quotes. And you really are the master quoter.
Thank you. You worry. It's one thing about quoting is I had a great old editor of the Times, Joe Lelyville, come up to me at a dinner recently and said, quoting's great. You're great at it. But he said, you want to leave the reader thinking about something the other guy said rather than the thing you said sometimes, which is a smart thing to say about quoting. You can do too much of it.
Let's talk about some of the other great writers that you've had on the podcast. You've mentioned one of the highlights for you was having Updike on. What was that like?
Well, that was a video. He agreed to come in. It was his last novel, which was not a terrific novel. And we did it in that beautiful boardroom upstairs that has the photographs of all the visiting dignitaries who've come to the Times, and Winston Churchill and Chaplin. And so we interviewed him there in video, and we talked about, it was right before the 2008 election. No one knew, including Updike himself, that he was mortally ill. He died just a couple of months later. They discovered lung cancer that he'd had contracted when he was much younger. But we talked about the 2008 election, and I'm a big fan of the Rabbit novels, which I reread. It's almost constant. I'm always reading them. I said, well, who would Rabbit Angstrom vote for in the 2008 election? And Updike said, well, I am so for Obama that I can't imagine creating a character who wouldn't vote for him. And I said, yeah, but in that last Rabbit novel, Rabbit at Rest, he voted for George Bush. And Updike said, he did? He didn't remember. And when you write that much, and I realized I knew those novels better than he did. But he still could talk about them better. And what he had was this great charm and grace, and he kind of spoke the way he wrote it. Some of you may know he had a slight stammer, which had been severe when he was young. But he spoke in these beautiful, polished, rounded sentences. And afterward, I got a note from somebody who said, Mr. Updike was on you interviewed him on video, and he wore a jacket and tie, and you did not show him the respect of wearing one.
And there he is. Look
And,
at him
and
now.
all I could say is you're right. Absolutely right. And Chip McGrath, who is a mentor to both Dwight and me, he was my predecessor at the book review, said he was right. If Updike comes in for an interview, you show him that respect, which I thought I'd done in person, but had not sartorially.
All right, that's one of your high literary favorites. But just to go a little bit very different kind of author, I think your real favorite may have been Keith Richards.
Pedro Rosario was in here, right? He taped that. We did that together. That was a telephone interview.
Were you really upset that he didn't come into the office?
No, we knew he wouldn't come in. What I assumed was this is Keith Richards, and if he's supposed to call in at 3 o'clock, we'll be lucky if we hear from him in the next 12 hours. And I got to our little studio, the booth we used for a studio, at about 2 minutes after 3, and Keith Richards was on the line
Waiting for you.
Yeah, but he was great. And he called Pedro Pete, which was like a great moment for him. I don't think anybody else would be allowed to call him Pete. But he was great. It was brilliant.
Let's listen to him.
So you called the book Life. You could have called it music. My first question to you, Keith Richards, is you're a great songwriter as well. Was writing this book in any way like composing a song?
Yeah, but a very long one. To go back and relive your life is... At first, I thought, of course, I can tell this story, no problem. I can, easily do that. But reliving certain things and piecing it all back together again was it was a trip, man. It was. I'm still recovering.
Did you find there were places you didn't really want to go? In the book you say that some of the genius of the early blues, early rock you listened to was the silence. You said that the silence was the canvas. When you're digging through your memory and you say you haven't forgotten any of it, are there areas that, in a kind of risky way, you've got to push into that you didn't want to?
Yeah, I suppose the most obvious is going through the death of your son. That was a real low point. But you had to deal with it and tell the story. When that sort of stuff happens to you, you do tend to shelve it, and reliving it was a bit difficult. But at the same time, now that it's been done, I feel a lot easier about it. But it was difficult at the time.
You don't sound at all nervous there, but were you talking to Keith Richards?
Yeah, I think I must have been, yeah. If you grew up when I did, nobody really gets much bigger than that, except maybe Dylan, who would have been like, you would never get on the phone.
Dwight, you interviewed
Excellent.
people, obviously, on occasion.
Once in a while.
Once in a while.
I was the bestseller list guy, which is like being I was the Al Roker. I was the weather guy of the.
You did Clive James though, and you did Richard Price. You did a lot of
I did
big
a couple,
runners.
but it was more like stationary front of James Patterson, some sprinkles to the west of Anne Rice. It was the Al Roker guy.
But who is your favorite person to interview?
I didn't do that many. Richard Price, for example, is just I think a heroic character and writer, and he knows so much about everything that just bringing him up, he was definitely one of the most interesting guys. He just has the sense about him of a life seriously lived. He's just intense, and it comes across. He's well spoken as well, so that's probably up there.
What was the idea with the bestsellers? Because I think we have two other previous bestseller columnists here, Greg Coles, our current, and Jenny Schuessler, but you were the first person to do the bestseller segment. What was your idea going in?
Trying to find a way to talk about these books, which don't often get talked about in the book review. We tried to review, many of the books on the bestseller list do get reviewed, but many don't, because many of the writers just have a new book every 6 months, and it's like the restaurant critic reviewing Olive Garden. What you're going to get, and it's not always worth your time. And
well, they don't need our help either.
Yes. So looking for a way to talk about these books and to let people know they were there, and to give the book review podcast an aspect of. I was listening today on the way and listening to Greg talk about what was on the list, and I realized that I don't always read the list that carefully because I'm lucky enough to live in this world where I just pick the books I want to read, and usually they're very good books of a pretty high level. And it was important and interesting to know who was selling right now and what this kind of means. And to put that stuff in context, I think, is a certain kind of cultural criticism.
Do you miss being on the podcast at all?
No, I despise the way I sound. So I'm very pleased to be off it, and I'm going to make sure I'm edited out of this one.
So, Gary, you're on Instagram now and Twitter and various other things, but you do not host a podcast, at least that I know of. Have you been a guest on other podcasts?
Because I don't know what a podcast is to this day.
Right.
I assume I have been because I've sat like this in front of people with 3 other people. That's a podcast, I assume.
Right, it's a panel podcast.
I think, yeah. By Jewish law, if you have 4 people, and a recording device, it's a podcast. So, yes, many podcasts have I seen.
But you love doing the podcast, Sam.
Yeah, it was the thing I miss most about your job. There's a lot about your job that's not that great.
That he doesn't miss at all.
But I really liked doing the podcast. And I see that Blake Wilson is here, who also worked with us on it for a long time. And Blake, remember once we interviewed the extremely smart and accomplished journalist James Traub. Do you remember this, Blake? And he was...
He's just going to deny it all.
He was so articulate, it was kind of hilarious. Blake said it was a little bit like the scene in Annie Hall where they pull out Marshall McLuhan to sort of correct the know-it-all in one. And it made me realize that there are people who speak almost too well, and it can sound as if it's memorized, even when it's not. But it's just, they tend to be journalists. Journalists are the easiest guests to have. You've probably noticed this, Pamela. Whenever you interview, say, a journalist at the paper, like Jenny Schuessler, if she's here, somebody who's written a story, if you interview them about the story they've just written, they lay it out for you as logically as the piece is done in the paper. And so there was always that kind of tendency to want to bring people like that in to talk. Walter Isaacson would give you sound bites all the time, and he sort of knew where the question was going before you got there. Jacob Weisberg is really, really good. Tom Friedman, the great columnist Tom Friedman, actually has an entire routine he works out, and if he stumbles, he stops because it's taped, and he goes through it again and makes sure that he's got the line right.
It's interesting because one of the things you do find out hosting a podcast is that writers tend to fall into two categories. There are the people who really are the way they write, and then the people who absolutely aren't. People who can be extremely dry and witty on the page, and then they come in and they're incredibly gray and boring to talk to, and vice versa. I don't know if you found that. There's often this dissonance.
Well, what do you like? Who were the guests you've liked best?
I knew you were going to turn the table, and I brought notes because even though you don't prepare, I do prepare, and also I have a terrible
Well, that's why
memory.
she has the job, and I no longer do.
So I have this here to talk a little bit about that. I think you mentioned, did you mention Mike Kinsley, or we were talking about that before? But
That might have been
there's
before.
some people who are just fun to talk to, and those are the people that I like to talk to on the podcast. It's almost irrelevant what they've written or what they've written about. David Carr, the late David Carr, was one of the first people I interviewed on the podcast, and he just knew how to do it. I felt like I was interviewing him to teach me how to be interviewing him while I was interviewing him. Ben McIntyre.
David Carr was a very good writer, but he was a great talker.
Yes. And some people here might remember for a while he had a kind of video podcast with Tony Scott, A.O. Scott, one of our chief film critics. That was really fun. Who else was great? Donna Tartt came in.
What was she like?
That was a big mystery because she's very, very low. I mean, you've met her,
Yeah,
but she's
she has a
generally
southern-
very low profile, doesn't do a lot of media, so I was excited to have her in. And I was about halfway through The Goldfinch. It was a rarity that I'd actually read the novel that the person was talking about. I was really interested to talk to her, but also very frightened that she was going to reveal something that I hadn't already read about. So I was kind of like drawing her out, but also sort of pushing back. And I would also say that I've made at least two people that I remember cry on the podcast, which it feels like a weird achievement of some kind.
Well, it depends what you did to make them cry.
Yeah, that's right. No, they cried in a good way. One of them, the incredibly articulate, and I hope I don't embarrass him by saying this, and I don't know if it came through. Jocelyn knows who cried because she sits in the room. Michael Peach, who is the CEO of Hachette and was David Foster Wallace's editor. He came in and we talked about what it was like to edit David Foster Wallace, and recently the 20th anniversary edition of Infinite Jest came out, and so he came in and we talked about that and about what it was like to go back to the novel and reread it after he had just reread it after Wallace's suicide. And then Andrew Solomon, who, like James Traub, is one of those people who speaks in completely beautiful, eloquent, perfect paragraphs. He did this amazing roundup review of 5 books recently for a theme issue we did called the Love and Death issue. It had, in that issue, Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air, a memoir that came out earlier this year, which would make anyone cry. But also Andrew worked on that review while his father was in the hospital. So it was a difficult review, an essay to write, and there was a lot of emotion and beauty in what he wrote, and I think that came out in the conversation. So I didn't feel too bad about making him cry. It felt appropriate to the subject. Did you make anyone cry? I'm going to be competitive now.
I think just the listeners. But you know what? They could turn it off. They didn't have to listen anymore.
I want to cry now on your podcast.
Yeah, right. That's the only way to get real credibility on the podcast.
I would love to cry. So much sadness.
What would a podcast hosted by you sound like, Gary?
What would a podcast hosted by me sound? Well, I like food a lot, so I want to have a podcast about food. That's what it would be about. If people just sit there and eat, you'd hear a lot of slurping noises.
It wouldn't be about sad Russian food.
No, I want to do exciting food, which is anything but Russian food.
There are, however, even if we don't make people cry, there are difficult parts about hosting the podcast. One of those, and I hope we don't offend anyone, especially Gary Shteyngart, novelists, but it can be very difficult to interview novelists. You warned me that fiction was hard.
Fiction is really hard to talk about. Fiction is difficult to review. Dwight knows this very well. It's easier to review. And Gary also is a brilliant critic. I want to say he wrote a number of great essays for us, but one of them was about Philip Roth. The early novels of Roth, and the theme of Gary's review was how Roth taught him to be a moral person.
Can you imagine?
Right, no.
Not that moral, but I went from Pol Pot to Philip Roth. You know.
But fiction is hard to review, and it's hard to talk about. The great book review editor at The New Yorker, Henry Finder, says that he tells reviewers when they're reviewing fiction for them, for The New Yorker, don't talk about the characters because they don't exist, and don't talk about the plot because none of it ever happened. So you have to write around it in some way, which is really hard to do. That's why so many fiction reviews read like book reports, and you describe all the plot incidents, and it doesn't really connect with a reader much of the time. And the same thing, alas, happens often with novelists and short story writers when you interview them, is there's so much inside the thing they've created that they don't describe it in a way that a listener can pick something up. So I would say, remember, the listener hasn't read the book and hasn't read the review when you're talking about it. And sometimes it will work and sometimes not.
Well, as the only representative of the novelist class here, Gary, is it hard to talk about your book when you do
No,
these
not
things?
at all. Oh my gosh.
What are you talking
Yeah,
about,
but you're
Sam?
good at it.
I'm good at it, but also every character I've ever written does exist because I have no imagination to create someone from scratch. And everything in my books has happened. 3 out of my 4 books featured circumcisions gone wrong. I mean, it's happened. I write from experience. So maybe
that's why he's good at it.
Yeah, that's why it's just blah, blah, me. It's like being at my shrinks, but, for this radio or whatever it is, podcast.
Was there anyone who was really hard to bring out of their shell, Sam?
I think there were many who were, but I'm trying to remember particular. I remember one thing that happened, and I was the interviewer, I realize now, and it was sort of a coup for us. Again, it was Julie Just, who was, at that point, the children's books editor. And I did not and do not follow children's literature as closely as I might or ought to, despite having a child in the house the entire time I was doing this. Julie had landed a very big-time children's book author, Suzanne Collins. Do you know who she is? And those books...
The Hunger Games.
The Hunger Games. And they were just... That's her name, right, Suzanne?
It is, yes. I was worried for you, Sam, that you wouldn't remember the name. But
Well, and they were really taking off, and I was just not paying attention. But Julie said, look, this is a really big thing. We have Suzanne Collins. This is like the new J.K. Rowling or something. And it's very, very big, and she's coming in to do the interview.
that is a big thing. She came in.
She came in, and Julie and I together were going to interview her. Suzanne pulled out a list of questions that she gave to Julie and read her answers off a piece of paper. And I wanted just to throw her out of the building.
Wow.
I wanted to throw her out. Because it was clear what the idea was here, that she had to kind of pietistically protect the shrine of her novels, so she couldn't misspeak or say something that might be misunderstood or misinterpreted. She needed a little bit of Donald Trump in her, I think. But so these novels were presented to us as this kind of temple that we might violate by talking about them. It was really dreadful. I don't know if you have that anywhere.
Did you go off script?
I'm trying to remember. I think we did not. I think Julie did most of it, and then she was mortified later. I think I just sort of tuned it out. I just didn't want to do it.
Well, books these days, I mean, anyone who's a critic or an editor knows, books these days tend to come to my house or to the office, and there's a list of questions normally tucked in by the publicist, hoping that a reporter will just ask these questions, which is just a set.
Really?
Your books surely are filled with the same
Oh my
thing.
God, I had no idea.
Yeah, I got a
write
list
them,
about
don't you?
circumcision. I know where that
This
came
is
from.
8 circumcision
Well,
questions.
the author often writes them themselves. They're often asked to write
Do
them.
they?
I've written.
I'm with the wrong publisher.
Was there anyone else who just, surprised you, threw you off?
Well, somebody who was fantastic, because he is probably sort of a bona fide genius, John Adams, the great composer. We did a remote broadcast with him, and remote just means the person's not present. And I don't know if the technology has since improved, but in that period, a number of years ago, you had only one line, so that one recording line. So if you interrupted the other person, you would actually sort of obliterate them. You wouldn't hear them. And that was normally a problem for me because I would talk over everybody just as I'm doing now. But John Adams had actually asked our great editor, David Kelly, who works with him, if he could be on the podcast because he was an admirer of it. And to me, like, this actual musical genius was asking if he could be a guest on our podcast. And he wanted to be told what all the rules were. He said, now, if I'm doing this remotely, right, there's a chance I'll cut you off, right? And he was a devotee of it. And he's also one of these guys who is essentially a polymath. He's a really good writer. He wrote a brilliant memoir. He's an excellent critic and all the rest. So that was another of these highlights where it sort of felt as if we were doing a more elevated thing. And he was very good and very serious-minded and wanted to make sure that he was kind of touching all the bases with the book and all the rest. So that, I don't know if it was a great interview, but what was impressive about that was just that he cared so much. Then you would have people like, Christopher Hitchens, who could do it in their sleep and kind of did it in their sleep. And would free associate, and Hitchens would come in and do 3 of them at once. He would do his own book. He would do the book he'd reviewed most recently and some other book he was going to review, and he'd do the podcast for that.
It's interesting because some people are the opposite, and it's very hard to get them to go off script. I don't know if you've had that feeling of someone who was just sort of so used to going through the motions that it was kind of hard to get them to have a real conversation.
Well, some people are nervous about it. Look, and I would say it's actually a simpler thing than it might seem. You think, well, why is this great writer having so much trouble talking? Well, one reason people become really serious writers is because they're not so good at talking. Right. They love language, but they're not talkers. They're writers. And so I think a lot of us grow up who are literary people or quasi or wannabe literary people thinking, if you speak too well, you're probably not really a good writer, because the good writers don't do that.
One of the things that is tricky, too, are people who are not writers, also difficult in their own ways. 2 that I interviewed recently, one was Susan Klebold, the mother of Dylan Klebold, and she had just come off of doing an interview with Diane Sawyer, so I had that to follow up. And I figured that I hadn't watched the Diane Sawyer interview, but I figured that was very heavily prepared, that she had sort of gone through all of the expected questions. And I didn't want to just kind of ask everything that Diane had asked, even though I wasn't sure what she asked. And that's where I feel like the podcast can be a little bit different, because the kinds of questions that we ask on the Book Review podcast are sometimes different from the ones that Diane Sawyer is going to ask for a networked TV show. And I asked her about the process of writing and picking a ghostwriter, because of course she had someone who wrote the book with her. And I think she had said that she had gone through like 3 or 5 previous ghostwriters before she ended up with the one that she had in the end. And I don't think that anyone had asked her about that, about what the actual writing of the book was like. And then there was another one very recently, Eric Fair, who wrote a book that we just recently reviewed about being an interrogator in Iraq and what it was like. And he was at Abu Ghraib. Those, I find, are often very difficult conversations, because you're asking people who are not really professional writers very, very sensitive questions about their lives.
I heard that interview today driving in with, it's Eric Fair?
Yes.
And it was very moving. You did a terrific job. I mean, he really was still haunted by it, was sorry he participated. He was an interrogator over in Iraq, and was just almost sorry about everything. I mean, it's just
So he'd been an interrogator of Iraqi.
Yes. And what was one of the most surprising things is, I asked him, do you regret writing the book? Or was the process of, I don't even think I asked it that way. I said, was it cathartic? Or was it very painful to write the book? And he said it was not cathartic at all. It was extremely painful, and I regret writing it. His publisher was probably like, no, don't say that. But that's what he said.
Well, I regret all my books, but only after the reviews come in. But let me ask you something else, though. Do you meet with people guests beforehand and put them at ease or anything like that? Or do you try to have a conversation?
Do the light and jolly
beforehand?
banter like you did?
Yeah.
No, you were very good at that. No,
Well,
I'm
I didn't mind
Harry.
wasting all the time, and you're actually trying to get your job done. But do you prepare people at all?
I don't. And that's actually very different, I think, between us on the podcast and on somewhere like public radio. I don't know if anyone here has ever been a guest on public radio, but I'm sure we all have. And you often have what's called a pre-interview, where they interview you about what they're going to interview you about, so that you kind of have this warm-up session, and you can say, look, don't ask about my mom, or sort of lay the groundwork. But sadly, we actually just don't have the time to do that, I think, fundamentally. So we just kind of dive right into it.
I wonder, Pamela, have you had any kind of, and did you, Sam, had any kind of training from the Times or from anyone about vocal training, about how to do this?
Well,
Because I find, Pamela, I'm listening on the way in today, and I've listened to you often. I think you're a natural at it, and kind of a calm, Terry Gross-like, probing voice. I really admire your voice, how it comes out on the radio. And I wonder your natural style. You didn't have any training or...
I'm paying him a large sum of money for this. No, I had no training at all, and I will admit that I don't listen to my own podcast. It's probably someone in here is like doing what the publisher did with Eric Ferrer, being like, "Don't say that." But I, like Dwight, cannot listen to myself talk. But I was on the other side always. So I had written 3 books before coming to the Times, and I did a lot of TV, a lot of NPR, and had done things. I had gone on Oprah, who's like the master, and does something that no one else can do, which is when you're on Oprah. Has anyone ever here been on Oprah? Sorry, that's an obnoxious question, but when you are on Oprah, or back in the day when there was Oprah, when you are on Oprah, there's suddenly in the room, even though it's filled with this live audience and there are other guests and whatnot, in the room it's just you and Oprah. And I felt while I was in the room with her that she was sending me a secret signal, and the signal was, no one else here matters. You and I understand that a lot of this stuff is sort of bull, and these people are crazy and whatever, but you and I have an understanding. And after this, we'll go to lunch and we'll be best friends. And, and then it ended, and it was like a little bubble burst, and Oprah got up and she just walked right by me. I never saw her again. So that was like something to look up to. Did you have any training?
We had a little, when it went actually on the radio for a while. There were a few years when the podcast was actually broadcast over WQXR and whatever station it became next, and I'm drawing a blank on it. And we even paid a little bit. We became AFTRA members, and we had dues, and we got paid a little bit. And at that point, we actually got training, and we were taught a number of things. That it's a little bit like if anybody ever studied poetry and you learn about this outmoded jargon, but masculine versus feminine endings for lines. You actually try to end on an up syllable rather than a down. Your voice tends to drop, so try to pick it up. All these things, if anybody who's done here will know that sort of thing. But one thing I learned, especially when we did events like this, and we'll sustain the Gary Shteyngart view that all podcasts are sort of these like these little minions of people who gather together, is that when men are on together, their voices all sound the same, and women sound distinctive. I notice even when you played the two of us, am I asking Gary questions for all the differences? Gee,
Someone
two
has a
short
Russian
Jewish
accent,
guys, hugely different. The voices actually sound a little similar, and then women's voices, I don't know what it is. It's a richer timbre, a palette, or something. What's that?
Is there a name for this
There's
effect?
got to be, but it sounds
should have
different.
done
And the producers here know it's true because Jocelyn and Blake and Mick and everybody, we would do it with several people, and it was guys. I would always say their names before or after they spoke because you could not tell one from another.
Oh my God.
And with women's, I
am never
voices.
being interviewed by another short Jew again. That's what I've learned.
Right, you should do Charlie Rose.
Charlie Rose, I need a
big
wasp.
Yeah, that's one thing I don't have to worry about. Good. If you were hosting this podcast right now and you were hosting, and Dwight, you were hosting, who would your dream interview be?
Sam got Updike. Updike's my guy. We got Gary the first time out. It's hard to top Mr. Shteyngart. Brilliant on the page and really funny.
Stop.
The whole package. Clive James, though, who I have talked to, but he's a hero of mine, and he's not doing well. And I would, and he's one of those people who speaks in paragraphs. I mean, he could dictate a book review. I think Nicholson Baker said this about Updike, that Updike could write his memoirs while climbing a ladder. That's how verbal he was.
Right.
And I get that sense with Clive James. He could be digging a hole and dictate a masterful piece about almost anything he's read or seen.
Sam, who would you have?
Philip Roth would be great because he does voices and he's really funny if you could get him going. Dylan, because he's like the genius of the age, and it would be interesting to see if you could get him to say anything.
Right.
That he hasn't said before. And at the moment, just in what remains of my journalistic self, someone I once had a telephone conversation with but never interviewed, Donald Trump, because I'd want to ask him about this Roy Cohn thing, which fascinates me. I'd be happy to do him if he would answer.
All right, Gary, who would you interview?
Oh, I guess I'd want Ice Cube. I mean, I went to the Oberlin Institute for Special People. It's a college in Ohio. It took me 17 years to graduate, but I did. And the only thing that kept me alive in Ohio was listening to Ice Cube day and night. And since then, I've been just listening to him talk, not on podcasts because I don't know what those are, but on various other channels, YouTubing channel, I think it is called. And I found out that he has so many of the same interests that I do. He's fanatical about modernist architecture, for example. If I had Ice Cube on, I could talk his ear off. He would.
Ice Cube gave, I think, one of the great movie performances ever in the movie Three Kings.
Oh
my God,
yes,
which I could watch
I used
that
to
over
memorize
and
that.
over.
Someone out there listening to this is going to get Gary and Ice Cube on stage soon.
Right, that's right. Whoever here knows Ice Cube, you just hook us up and we'll have Gary and Ice Cube on. And
I will stop writing books if that happens, which hasn't worked out that great anyway.
thank you so much. It's so much fun to have all of these guys. Thank you. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.